Hello and welcome to another conversation in Practical Theology. I'm Saiyyidah Zaidi and I'm joined with my co-host Eric Stoddart, and today we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. Eric is researching in the topic of surveillance, and I thought that it would be quite interesting for me and you to understand a little bit more about his research. Surveillance, I think, is quite a interesting subject and topic, and as a layperson I have an understanding of what it means, but I have no real kind of concept of how that could be a study in relation to practical theology. So it'll be really interesting to unpack some of that today. And I'm going to kind of begin the conversation with something that was quite a fond memory of mine when I was doing my studies in architecture in Glasgow, in that one of my fellow students, fine art student, did a study into all of the surveillance cameras and the CCTV cameras from the art school to Central Station. Now, bearing in mind, this was 1995, there were 430. So I hate to think what it is right now. But Eric, tell us what your research is and how you got into the subject of surveillance.
Okay, surveillance for me is any gathering of personal data with a view to influencing people's behaviour. So it's a very, very wide net that I cast over surveillance. And it all actually goes back as a research topic to a single footnote in a book back in somewhere around about 2003, I think. I was writing a course, an honours course on citizenship, and there's lots of Christian theological things about citizenship, different ideas of how people should be contributing to society, enabling others to participate in society. So that made a lot of sense to think theologically as a practical theologian about citizenship. But I wanted to do one little section of that course on e-citizenship, because at that stage, 2003, governments were starting to deliver services through electronic portals. So you had to sign on to the local authority and you had to get a password and for all sorts of different things. And there was a sociology book that was talking about electronic citizenship and how local government and national government was gathering information about people and using it in different ways. But there was one in this sociology book, one little footnote to a Christian theologian. And I thought, this is odd. And so I followed that little footnote through, and it turned out that the author of the article, who was the first thing I'd read by him, is a Christian, writes as a professional sociologist, and is Mr. Surveillance Studies in the whole world, a guy called David Lyon, based in Canada. And having followed through that footnote back in 2003, I eventually was able to spend a research period at David's centre in the sociology department at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, in Canada, where I wrote the first book on surveillance. And I've been corresponding with David. David's been involved in various events that I've organised over the years, and he's been very supportive about thinking about how are human beings shaped by surveillance. And David Lyon's work has really been influential for me in asking those sorts of questions that are not really about privacy as such, and they're not questions about the in-depth technologies, but it's a question of how are we, with all these different types of surveillance, being shaped? How's our mental attitude being shaped about ourselves, about other people, and how do these practices of surveillance fit with other ways that we conduct ourselves in life and other biases and prejudices? So it gets me into racial discrimination, it gets me into issues of poverty discrimination, and that's where it then becomes a practical theology task, because I want to try and understand from a Christian perspective, where is God in all of this? And how can I understand, to even begin to answer that question in the context of surveillance, but using a practical theology method of reflection?
So it's interesting for me because listening to you is making me think about how humans are observing each other and surveying each other. But there is also another dimension that you quite rightly mentioned about God. And so one of the things that I'm kind of taught as a Muslim is that, you know, whatever action it is that you're doing, always remember that God is watching you. And sometimes that actually prevents you from doing the thing that you might be thinking of doing. Now, there is that layer of surveillance, and I think maybe we'll come back to that. But what you're describing in many ways about how people use surveillance could be construed to create an atmosphere of fear.
That's one of the problems of surveillance, because it responds to fear. The use of surveillance technologies is largely a response of fear. And some of that fear is justified. There are dangerous people, there are dangerous circumstances out there. It is a risky world that we live in. And I don't want to over minimize that risk. But those risks and those fears are socially constructed. Why we fear, what we fear, who we fear, the ways in which we fear badly or fear rightly, those are all part of our social circumstances. And we're influenced by the media, we're influenced by politicians, we're influenced by our faith communities, we're influenced by our own experiences. And that, to me, is a really intriguing aspect, that we can actually generate more fear by having surveillance that is used to try and address the fear. So it becomes something like a vicious cycle.
Yeah, and I think business and government intervention in all of this is quite interesting as well, particularly when we look at, for example, you know, many listeners will be aware of the whole discussion around Cambridge Analytics and Facebook, and how allegedly elections were rigged as a result of this. So how does all of that play into your work as a practical theologian?
Yeah, I've got a chapter in the book that I'm currently writing at the moment, which is going to be about surveillance and the common good. So it's back to that: how is surveillance affecting how people flourish, how they affect their relationships with each other as citizens, as individuals. And I've got a chapter I'm writing at the moment on the datafied citizen, which is basically saying that as citizens, so much of our lives is being turned into data, that we're actually producing data for big corporations as well as for government. And a lot of that data is actually really useful, because census data is surveillance. And how health service funding is distributed across the country is partly to do with the distribution of population. So we need that surveillance data to know where to distribute our spending on health. So there's some very positive things to say about surveillance data. But as citizens, there are issues where our response to political things can be chilled. There's this chilling effect where we're not actually being told, you cannot do this, you can't speak out against this. It's still perfectly legal to protest within certain limits, and to speak, we have freedom of speech within certain limits. But there's a chilling effect of surveillance, because if we think about the amount of data that's gathered by Facebook, by Twitter, that is keeping in pretty much in perpetuity things that we say about surveillance, about politics. A lot of those things are completely innocuous. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think that all of these things are part of some great plot against us. But there's a difference between having a chat with someone And knowing that that chat is somehow or other recorded, that becomes especially important if you're someone working in advocacy for human rights or freedom. And there have been cases where advocacy groups have had their data hacked. And part of the big political argument about, well, there should be a back door into all encrypted conversations and email, WhatsApp exchanges or whatever, so that governments can fight terrorism. That has a huge implication for those groups that are working for human rights. Because if you can't guarantee an encrypted channel for someone to talk about human rights in an environment where they're under threat and bring it to the attention of an advocacy group, then you're really chilling those people's conversations. They're really not able to do the advocacy and to get the information they need. But at a much less serious level, it can make people just pause and think, do I want this conversation kept forever? Will it be cast up to me at some point? So this is not a great thing about saying we're being suppressed, but people are just thinking twice about what they might say. And that's a chilling effect. There's lots of different degrees to it, but I think it affects our political discourse.
Mm. And how does it affect our religious discourse?
I think it's really interesting that I'm not sure that religious people think that more about surveillance than anybody else. But if you're a particular religious minority, you can be thinking a lot about surveillance. I saw an article by colleagues in New York, and they were doing work about surveillance informants being planted into mosques in New York. And the real dilemma that raised for Muslim worshippers in New York, because their concern was not to unjustly be suspicious of someone, but at the same time they thought, well, we know that New York Police Department are paying informers. So how do we balance up our religious responsibility to be trusting of people and not to be falsely suspicious with the realities of being under surveillance as a community? It's also the case for the Uyghur people in northwest China. It's been true during the communist regimes for religious people of various persuasions, not being sure just what the extent of surveillance is and having to be cautious if you're particularly targeted as a group.
I mean, there's so much to unpack in that. And as you're speaking, I'm thinking, when was the earliest incidence of surveillance? And actually, I think it goes back, hundreds of years before World War II, And so I suppose, reading the paper that you sent, or briefly, you made references to Jesus and surveillance at that time. What can we learn from early religious leaders about how they approach surveillance that will assist us today?
I think we realize that surveillance is a very human activity, and it's absolutely necessary to how we function in societies. It's everything from, in a small village, people looking out from behind the shutters and seeing something happening in the street, gossiping about it, passing that news on. It's about the tradition of having watchmen who are armed on the city walls or at the city gates, surveilling the surrounding area. It's about building your forts on areas where you not only can command the land, but you can see. So we're talking a very human function here. What for me is interesting with a figure like Jesus is that he himself was under surveillance. He was under surveillance by the Romans. He was under surveillance by other Jewish leaders of different kinds at the time. I think principally because Jesus was disrupting the social order. He was challenging understandings of holiness that his own Jewish community were putting forward. He was challenging the ideas about what food you ate when and what tithing you had to give. He was challenging the boundaries of reaching out in terms of touching the sick. He was crossing religious, ethnic boundaries. He was, in some sense, seen by some as a Messiah, which was a political figure. So that brings him to the attention of the Roman authorities. And I think that actually Jesus, we could say, was killed at least partly because he was under surveillance. The evidence that was used, evidence that was extrapolated about what he'd been doing, came really through surveillance. And Jesus, yes, was watching people like everyone else, but I think Jesus was always challenging prejudice. Sometimes he was challenged with prejudice himself in his approach to the Syro-Phoenician woman who was not a Jew, and there's a great debate about just what was Jesus saying there. But Jesus was reaching out beyond his own community boundaries. Jesus was challenging people to think about how they viewed others. He was really subverting ideas that there are those who are inside and those who are outside, and we have to be frightened of those on the outside. And so Jesus is a figure that was challenging how we viewed boundaries. I don't think he is a figure who did away with boundaries. He was very clear in his talking about those who were with him and advancing the kingdom of God and those who were not. So he's not a simplistic figure in that sense, but I think boundaries and surveillance go together. And the figure of Jesus, for me, and his teaching makes me zoom in on the boundaries and say, what is surveillance doing, particularly to people at boundaries, whether that's ethnicity, whether it's wealth, whether it's travel, whatever it is, where those boundaries are happening.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there's a lot of challenge that comes from surveillance at the moment in the world. And what you were saying about surveillance on the boundary is quite interesting, because the people who are going to be affected by it the most are the minorities, or they're the ones that put their hands up and say, some of this isn't right. So how do we kind of turn some of this into a positive? Because I think that you're absolutely right in that surveillance has the opportunity to be used for good, but I think because of the way that a lot of the data is being collected, it has become very political and very business focused, and sometimes, sadly, the ethics and the morals of the people who are in charge are not quite what we would want or need.
I think that's certainly an understatement. I've been toying with an analogy, and let me try that out with you and see what you think. If you pick up a packet of tablets of pharmaceutical drugs, and you have a look on the side of that box, there are all sorts of tiny print about contraindications. So if you have a particular condition, you must not take this drug. There are side effects that, yes, you may experience drowsiness or you may experience some nausea, but it's okay. This drug is actually more use to you than it outweighs the side effects. And then there'll be things like saying, you shouldn't take this if you're under a certain age, and those sort of categories. And that, I think, is an interesting analogy about how we could progress with thinking about surveillance. Because part of the commercial issue with surveillance is a lot of it happens behind closed doors. It happens in the black box, where for commercial sensitivity, there's not access to know exactly how is our data being processed. Parliamentarians face that issue when they try and legislate against particular abuses of surveillance, because they meet this black box, closed door of companies and the security service, obviously, wanting to keep things under wraps. But when we think back to that analogy about the box of tablets, we're not being told the formulae for these particular tablets. It's not breaching that commercial sensitivity. The ingredients are there on the box, but how you would actually make them up into that particular drug is not revealed. So there is commercial protection, but the indications are there of when this is safe to use, when it's not safe to use. And I think that's a way forward that I'm toying with as a sort of model, to take that from the pharmaceutical industry into surveillance and say, here are contraindications. In this type of situation, you shouldn't be using this type of surveillance. Or if you use this type of surveillance, here are the side effects. Let's decide how we want to weigh up the risk of doing that. And so it becomes much more specific. What are the implications of using surveillance in terms of the Department of Work and Pensions and welfare benefits of a particular kind? What are the contraindications? When should that not just be an automatic surveillance mechanism decision? When has there to be human intervention? What sort of control over that human intervention? So it's getting down to very specifics, but trying to get some sort of an analogy that we've worked out elsewhere, but we haven't yet worked out for surveillance.
Mm. I mean, it makes sense, but I would also argue when it comes to medicine in that, for example, if somebody goes to the doctor with high blood pressure or they're pre-diabetes or diabetes, and the response is to give medication rather than to do a lifestyle change. And for me as an individual, I'm always going to advocate lifestyle change, because I think that the human race now is just, it's being controlled by medication.
I think you're right in terms of the uses of medication. And you're right, I think, to say, let's start with lifestyle change. In terms of surveillance, I think we're up against such vested interests in terms of not just national, but trans-global companies that cut across so many political jurisdictions that the role of the individual in making those sorts of choices can be really quite limited. Unless you're going to go, the phrase is off the grid, and try and leave as little a digital footprint as possible, that's going to be harder and harder to gain access for example, to health service, to insurance, to your driving license or whatever. So the practicalities for individuals making decisions are relatively limited. And I think that's where we really need concerted international political effort to be controlling and properly scrutinizing multinational data processing companies.
I think what you're saying is correct, but I think I mean, perhaps for another conversation, but I've lost all faith in the political system. You know, it's very hard, particularly with what has happened in the last few days with Brexit in the UK, to really have any level of confidence that those in charge are able to make rational decisions. So when it comes to something like this, where it's so nuanced and the people or the organizations who have the control actually have the power, I can't see how anyone can actually make sense of it in the way that humanity needs. Because this, for me, the whole subject about surveillance is more than just governmental. It's even more than, you know, something like the World Health Organization or any international organization, because the impact of these things on individual humans is it can make individuals' lives a lot easier, or it can be incredibly catastrophic. And I don't know if you saw the program that was on the BBC recently called, I think it was called the Charge or something. Hold on, I'm going to find it. Was a fascinating program, The Capture. That's it. And I think that is an interesting extreme of how surveillance can be used to manipulate the truth. I see how some of that is unpacking in individuals' daily lives to be in the form of the algorithm that is used by social media. And for example, even if we go to an app for watching films and TVs, once we've kind of seen a few things, then it starts making recommendations, and those recommendations are based on our choice. So the individual's perspective is narrowed by the things that they're accessing, not by them.
Yeah, and I think I've been in a similar place as you, wondering how on earth, with the failure of our politicians, often who have so little technical knowledge and don't realise the absence of that knowledge, that's actually worse. How does this move forward? The recent Netflix documentary, The Great Hack, tells the story of the Cambridge Analytica thing, but it starts with a guy called David Carroll in the US, a professor of communications. And he has, I think, got a bit of hope, and rightly so, because he doesn't see the political response at national level. It starts for him at the level of the states in the US. And he thinks that certainly California's recent data legislation has been for him a really interesting development. And he thinks that given the nature of the United States, with so much data circulating, if local, in the sense of state legislatures, get their act together, like California has done, there will be different, slightly nuanced and different legal situations, regulatory regimes across all the states in the US. The big multinational companies will hate that, so they will pressure the federal government to come up with a national system. Now, in the European Union, there's been the recent GDPR and concerted effort at a European level. So there's a slightly different model going there of how that's been progressed. I think if we do give up on the politicians, we are completely at the mercy of transnational capitalist companies. We have to find ways in which our politicians take this on. If they don't, then we are all, just going to hell in a handbasket, basically, because this is about making money. Whether it's security, whether it's addressing fear, whether it's about health data, this is all about making money. And if there's not regulation of that, we then simply become cogs in a great capitalist venture that abuses us. So I wouldn't give up hope for our politicians. It may not, in certain places, be national politicians. I think it may well, like California, be more at a state level within the US. But there are serious politicians who are really engaging with this. And I think as a public, we have to get behind them and support what they're doing, be very critical sometimes of what they're proposing, but actually see that we can't just let this be a free market.
What do you think about the point of manipulated data? Like, for example, I know it was fiction, but the capture raises some really interesting issues for all of us.
Yes, this is about being able to manipulate visual images so that, to all intents and purposes, it seems that someone is doing or saying something that never actually happened. We're familiar with it with varying degrees of efficiency with Photoshop and other products with still images, but this now into moving images. This is getting us into a territory where we're becoming suspicious of everything that we see. And that's really quite worrying, because our democratic processes depend on us having reasonable certainty that Jane Bloggs, a particular politician, said this on such and such an occasion, and she's held accountable for that. She gets support on the basis of that, or she is denied support because of what she said. If we're now moving into an unregulated regime where people can manipulate images so that it's very difficult to tell what actually happened and what actually was said, it then becomes the case whoever has the most money wins the election. We're back to, in the UK, there was the rotten boroughs, we're rolling back democracy to become something that has a veneer of people's choice, but it is actually the product of those who have the most money to buy the most effective data manipulation products. Now, that's not necessarily what was happening on the fictional capture, but it's also happening in terms of the information that's presented to people, what we receive in social media, how that's filtered to us, perhaps without us even being aware it's being filtered. It changes public perceptions, and public perceptions are so askew from reality that then people make political decisions, not just on lack of information, but on false information. And that changes how society is constructed. And so in terms of images, in terms of words, in terms of what we think that we have found out, if we've done any research as individuals, the whole point of those who want to manipulate us is to put a question mark over who is actually saying anything truthful anymore. And that's very, very dangerous territory for us to be in.
I mean, I think to some degree it's always been the reality, because one of the things that I've realized as I'm doing my kind of reflexivity for my research is that there's the truth, then there's my version of the truth, and then there's somebody else's version of the truth, and then there's how it gets presented. And I think these are all very different things. And really, as individuals, we will never know the truth, because even if we see something, we're still putting our own layer of interpretation on it. And so that given, with what you're saying about surveillance, it does make me quite worried, because I think manipulation is very easy. And so, I mean, I appreciate that program is fiction, but it does make one question, and particularly when we see cases of injustice that have happened in the last 100 years or so, where people have been in prison for 20, 30, 40 years, and then been told, of course you're perfectly innocent, we'll just give you $1 million here and there, as compensation, off you go. I can only see that that's going to be happening more so.
Yes, I think more so, unless we have a really vigorous rule of law. And I think this is where the courts become even more important, because the whole process in a court of taking the different perspectives and different truths and testing those with rigorous cross-examination and weighing up and deciding on the balance of the evidence, it's highly likely that this happened rather than the way someone else is saying it's happened. That degree of critical thinking in the courts is absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital in terms of what universities are doing, about enabling students to develop those critical skills. Almost doesn't matter what subject area that they're studying, but the learning the critical skills to be able to transfer those into other aspects. It's about how people of faith develop those critical skills to think about their own faith perspectives, but also use those critical skills to think about the world and the evidence that they encounter across a whole lot of areas. And the only hopeful way forward, I think, is if that level of critical reflection is something that becomes more dominant in our public discourse, but also not just in public discourse, but there is the backstop of the courts of law. And seeing the importance of not simply people following the law, but it's the It's the examination of evidence, I think, that is really the most crucial thing, and the forensic questioning of that. That's where our media have a huge responsibility, which I think many of them have been failing. They have not taken their role as one of the other avenues of critical reflection. And if that vigorous questioning was much more prevalent in the media, I think we would stand a better chance of standing up to being manipulated. But the media is there and has become itself commercialized to such a great extent that we now notice when there is excellent journalism because it's unusual.
Mm. And I think we ignore when there is manipulation, because I know in my circles there's a big discussion that's happening at the moment about how Meghan Markle's being treated versus Kate, and or Princess Kate, and it's very, very clear that there is an agenda of underlying racism and quite negativity towards Meghan Markle, which I think shows the biases that the media has, yet it's something that I suspect the media will never address and never actually acknowledge. So some of the things that you're raising are really, really critical, but I think we do live in quite challenging times because we have institutions and organizations that should be taking responsibility which aren't. So go ahead.
Yeah, I think taking responsibility, and it's so difficult for those journalists of integrity who they don't control what appears under their name in a newspaper article. They don't write the headlines. They don't get to decide the line of questioning necessarily in a TV interview. There are producers, there are directors of news, and I suppose my greatest criticism is directed towards those newspaper editors, proprietors, directors of news, not to the individual journalists, because in many cases, I think those journalists have proven in the past to be people of great critical integrity. But the ecosystem is stymieing them from doing their job. And that comes down to me as a member of the public. How do I support journalism that is proper, decent, interrogated journalism? How do I support my local MP in asking those types of critical questions in select committees? Who do I actually vote for? Do I vote for someone who gives me what I want to hear, or am I willing to be critically thinking about what it is, the bubble that I'm living in? So there is an element of our personal responsibility there, but I think we have to tackle it on so many different fronts. That's the really difficult thing about surveillance, because it's not just about watching, and it's not just about data being analysed. It's about how this merges in with wider societal attitudes, prejudices, aspirations, and it's often difficult actually to separate off surveillance as something that's disconnected from wider social issues. It makes it very difficult to write a book about it because there's always another rabbit hole to go running down. But I think that's the nature of where we are. Some people use the term surveillance society, and I think there's a lot of value in that, because it gets us thinking that this is part of how we respond as a society to things that go wrong. We want more data analysed. We have a sort of view of somehow data is objective, and we allow ourselves into a false sense of security.
So just to wrap up, I think that you've said some really interesting things about how we can respond as individuals to some of the challenges that are presented by the surveillance society that we live in. And I think critical thinking is the key one. And that is a skill that sadly I see is being lost in education. So I would encourage all of us to remember that we should always be upskilling ourselves. And if you feel as if you don't have the necessary critical thinking skills, then, you know, there's plenty of books that are written on how to develop that. And, you know, one thing that's fairly easy to do is just always take a step back and think, well, you know, where is this information coming from? What is the agenda of the people who are writing it and sharing it? And I think just having that critical thinking approach is really important to having a balanced response to surveillance. Eric, I'd love to hear, what's the name of your book and when are you hoping that it's going to be published?
I'm hoping it'll be published in the latter part of next year, 2020. It's going to be called The Common Gaze, Gaze, merging together this idea of the common good and the gaze of surveillance. So Common Gaze, it'll be published by SCM, and it should be out, hopefully, as a suitable Christmas present for not this Christmas, but next Christmas.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing with us your research and what you're working on. It's certainly given me a lot to think about, because I think the subject of surveillance is something that affects all of us, regardless of whether we're aware of it or not. And I hope that listeners are going to share their thoughts or their comments underneath the video or on this podcast here. We are going to join you very, very soon for another episode of Conversations in Practical Theology. So we'll see you soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks for listening, folks, and just be aware you're being watched.